History loves to tell us about kings, warriors, conquerors, the men who stood atop crumbling empires and forged new ones from the ashes. But what if the real power behind those thrones wasn't always the figure wearing the crown? Picture this: the Dark Ages, a time of chaos and upheaval, when Europe's fate hung in the balance. While chroniclers scribbled tales of kings and battles, there were others, women of extraordinary cunning, courage, and vision, who pulled the strings, brokered peace, and kept the flames of civilization alive. Their names have faded, their stories buried under layers of dust and disregard. But today, we're lifting the veil on these forgotten queens, the quiet architects of an era we thought we knew. Think about the last time you heard a story about the Dark Ages. Chances are it was filled with swords, sieges, and the deeds of men like Charlemagne or Alfred the Great. But what about the women who ruled beside them or even in their stead? Queens like Ethelflad of Mercia, who led armies to defend her kingdom against Viking invasions, or Brunhilda of Austrasia, whose political brilliance held a fracturing realm together for decades. These weren't just figureheads, they were strategists, diplomats, and leaders who shaped the course of history. Yet their legacies were erased, their contributions minimized or outright ignored. Why? Because history, as it's often written, prefers its heroes to fit a certain mold. So why does this matter now? Because these women's stories aren't just footnotes, they're a missing piece of the puzzle, a lens through which we can see the Dark Ages anew. Imagine a world where kingdoms didn't survive by brute force alone, but through the quiet, relentless work of queens who negotiated treaties, patronized scholars, and preserved culture while empires crumbled around them. Their resilience in the face of oblivion is a testament to the power of leadership that doesn't seek the spotlight. And as we uncover their tales, we're not just correcting the record, we're rediscovering a blueprint for what it means to lead when the world seems determined to forget you. Ready to meet the women who defied an age of darkness? Let's begin. The Dark Ages get their name from the shadow cast over Europe after the fall of Rome, a time when written records faded, cities crumbled, and the old order collapsed. But darkness doesn't mean emptiness. In the spaces between battles and invasions, a different kind of power was at work. While kings clashed over land and titles, it was often queens who kept the machinery of rule turning. They weren't just wives or mothers of rulers, they were regents, diplomats, and strategists in their own right. Take, for example, the Frankish Queen Fredegund, who rose from humble origins to become one of the most feared political minds of the 6th century. While her husband fought wars, she orchestrated alliances, crushed rebellions, and secured her son's throne, all while historians of the time reduced her to little more than a scheming villainess. This was an era when survival demanded more than brute strength. With borders shifting and loyalty as fragile as parchment, queens became experts in the art of soft power. They brokered marriages to prevent wars, funded monasteries to preserve knowledge, and governed when their husbands were away or incapable. In Wessex, Queen Edba wielded influence so vast that chroniclers blamed her for the kingdom's misfortunes, simply because they couldn't fathom a woman holding such authority. Meanwhile, over in Burgundy, Queen Clotilda used her piety and political savvy to convert her pagan husband to Christianity, reshaping the religious landscape of Europe. These women didn't just adapt to chaos, they mastered it. And yet, the term Dark Ages does them a disservice. It implies a vacuum of culture, a silence where there was actually a hum of activity, just not the kind historians once cared to notice. Queens like these patronized scholars commissioned illuminated manuscripts and built the networks that kept trade and ideas flowing. When we call the period dark, we're echoing the biases of those who wrote the histories, men who overlooked the quiet labor of women in favor of louder, bloodier tales. But dig deeper and you'll find their fingerprints everywhere, in the laws that protected the vulnerable, in the treaties that paused decades of war, in the books that survived because a queen ordered them copied. The darkness wasn't total, it was just unevenly lit. So how did they do it? How did these women navigate a world that insisted they belonged in the background? The answer lies in their ability to work within and around the limits of their time. Some, like the Byzantine Empress Irene, seized power outright, ruling in her own name despite furious opposition. Others, like Matilda of Tuscany, became indispensable to popes and emperors alike, using their wealth and wit to shape the fate of nations. They understood that influence wasn't always about the crown you wore, but the alliances you forged, the debts you called in, and the stories you left behind. And though their names were often scrubbed from the record, their legacies endured in the borders we still see on maps, in the customs that outlived their eras, in the simple fact that light, however faint, never fully went out. Among the shadowy halls of Merovingian Europe, where power shifted like quicksand and loyalty was often bought with blood, one woman stood unshaken for more than 4 decades: Brunhilda of Austrasia. This wasn't a queen who merely kept the throne warm. She was a ruler in every sense, a lawmaker, a military strategist, and a political survivor who played the game of crowns with ruthless precision. Married into the fractious Merovingian dynasty, she didn't just adapt to its cutthroat politics, she mastered them. While kings rose and fell, Brunhilda endured, outmaneuvering assassins, rebellious nobles, and even her own kin. Consider the sheer scale of her achievements. She reformed outdated legal codes, ensuring fairer trials and protections for the vulnerable. She fortified cities, led armies to defend her grandson's throne, and brokered alliances that kept her realm from splintering. Yet, if you read the chronicles of her enemies, men like the Bishop Gregory of Tours, you'd think she was little more than a vengeful schemer. They called her a Jezebel, accused her of witchcraft, even blamed her for the deaths of rival kings. But here's the question: would a man wielding the same power have faced such vilification? Or was Brunhilda punished by history simply because she refused to fade into the background? The truth is, her story reveals a double standard as old as time. When a king crushed rebellions, he was strong. When a queen did the same, she was cruel. When a man outmaneuvered his rivals, he was shrewd. When a woman did it, she was deceitful. Brunhilda's greatest crime, in the eyes of her detractors, wasn't her ambition. It was her refusal to apologize for it. Even her brutal end, dragged to death by a wild horse at the age of 70, was framed as divine retribution rather than the political murder it was. Yet look closer and you'll see her fingerprints all over the Europe that emerged from the Dark Ages. The legal reforms she championed laid groundwork for justice beyond her lifetime. The monasteries she patronized became beacons of learning in a chaotic world, and perhaps most tellingly, the very rivals who vilified her copied her tactics the moment she was gone. Brunhilda's legacy isn't just a tale of one woman's defiance, it's a mirror held up to history itself, forcing us to ask who gets remembered and why. Was she ruthless? Undoubtedly. But in an age where weakness meant annihilation, her iron will was the price of survival, and that's a truth no propaganda can erase. While Brunhilda wielded power with calculated strategy, Fredegund of Neustria ruled with a blade's edge, unflinching, uncompromising, and utterly relentless. Her story begins not in a palace but in the shadows, as a servant who caught the eye of King Chilperic. What followed wasn't a fairy tale ascent, it was a masterclass in survival. In a world where queens could be discarded like yesterday's alliances, Fredegund didn't just climb the ladder, she burned it behind her. When Chilperic's first wife, Galswintha, mysteriously died, strangled in her bed, suspicion fell squarely on Fredegund. No trial followed, no outcry from the chroniclers, just a silent understanding that this was how the game was played. But calling Fredegund a mere murderer misses the point. Her violence wasn't senseless, it was surgical. Every assassination, every poisoned cup, every whispered plot served one purpose: to keep her son Clothar on the throne. When rival nobles threatened rebellion, she had them slaughtered. When her own stepson stood in her son's way, she ordered his throat cut. Even her own daughter wasn't spared. When the girl's marriage threatened Fredegund's plans, legend claims she personally smothered her. These weren't the acts of a monster, but of a woman who understood the brutal arithmetic of power. In 6th century Neustria, mercy was a luxury queens couldn't afford. What makes Fredegund so fascinating isn't just her ruthlessness, it's how openly she defied the expectations of her time. While other queens worked through proxies and plausible deniability, Fredegund owned her actions. She didn't hide behind male advisors or feign ignorance. When her husband was assassinated, she didn't retreat to a nunnery as widows were expected to do. She seized control of the treasury, rallied loyal troops, and ruled as regent with a grip tighter than any king's. Her enemies called her a she-wolf, a demon in woman's guise, but none dared say it to her face. Yet for all her infamy, Fredegund's reign brought something unexpected: stability. The same hand that wielded a dagger also lowered taxes, reformed the legal system, and built churches. She understood that terror alone couldn't sustain a kingdom. People needed bread as much as they feared the sword. In this, she mirrored the paradox of so many Dark Age queens, capable of both astonishing cruelty and shrewd governance. Modern eyes might judge her harshly, but consider the alternative. Had Fredegund faltered, her son would have been killed, her allies massacred, Neustria plunged into civil war. In a world where weakness meant annihilation, her brutality may have been the lesser evil. The real tragedy of Fredegund's story isn't her violence, it's how history remembers her. Chroniclers like Gregory of Tours painted her as a cautionary tale, a warning against women in power. But strip away the moralizing, and you find a ruler who did what few men of her era could. She held a fracturing kingdom together through sheer force of will. Her methods repel us, but her dilemma remains hauntingly familiar. How far would you go to protect what's yours? In the end, Fredegund's legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the darkest acts aren't born of evil, but of necessity. And that's a shade of gray history rarely pauses to examine. Theodora of the Franks never raised a sword, never ordered an execution, never seized power through force, and yet her influence stretched further than many kings who did. In a world where Brunhilda and Fredegund ruled through iron wills and sharper blades, Theodora chose a different weapon: the quiet, relentless art of diplomacy. While others fought for dominance, she wove alliances like threads in a tapestry, binding fractured kingdoms together through the most powerful tool of her era: marriage. Take a moment to consider the chaos she inherited. The Merovingian dynasty was a nest of vipers, with rival branches of the family constantly at each other's throats. Kings murdered their nephews, brothers betrayed brothers, and borders shifted with the wind. Into this maelstrom stepped Theodora, a queen who understood that real power wasn't just about winning battles, it was about preventing them. She arranged marriages not as romantic gestures, but as geopolitical chess moves. Her daughters wed kings of rival realms, turning potential enemies into in-laws. Her sons married women whose families brought land, loyalty, or leverage. Every union was calculated, every alliance a bulwark against chaos. What's striking isn't just the scale of her strategy, it's how invisible it seemed. Chroniclers of the time barely noted her efforts, focusing instead on the kings who claimed credit for peace. But look closer and the pattern emerges. When Austrasia and Neustria teetered on the brink of war, it was Theodora's kinship ties that cooled tempers. When Burgundy's loyalty wavered, her grandchildren sat on its throne. She didn't just play the game, she redesigned the board, turning blood feuds into bloodlines. And here's the lesson that echoes across centuries: leadership isn't always about being seen. Theodora's power lived in letters carried by midnight riders, in whispered counsel at feasts, in the unbreakable bonds of family she forged. While warlike kings burned through their reigns in a blaze of glory, her subtlety gave her something far more precious: longevity. For over 3 decades, her web of alliances held firm, a testament to the strength of patience over passion. Yet history's bias toward dramatic acts nearly erased her. We remember the battlefield heroes, the tyrants, the larger-than-life figures, but how often do we celebrate the peacemakers? Theodora's story forces us to ask why we equate influence with visibility. In an age obsessed with charismatic leaders, her legacy is a reminder that some of the most transformative acts happen offstage. The treaties no one witnesses, the compromises that go unrecorded, the quiet conversations that avert wars, these too shape the world. So the next time you hear about the Dark Ages, think beyond the swords and crowns. Think of Theodora, the queen who ruled not by fear, but by kinship, not by force, but by foresight. Her methods may lack the drama of her contemporaries, but in a world tearing itself apart, her greatest victory was the peace she built, one marriage, one alliance, one invisible thread at a time. Imagine being torn from your home as a child, thrust into the court of the man who slaughtered your family, then forced to marry him. This was Raidgun's reality, a Thuringian princess captured by King Clothar of the Franks, her people massacred, her future rewritten by conquest. Yet from this unimaginable trauma, she forged a legacy that would outshine her captors. While most queens of her era sought power through crowns or armies, Raidgun chose a radically different path. She turned her suffering into sanctity, and in doing so, reshaped the very idea of what influence could look like. At first glance, her story seems to fit neatly into the trope of the pious medieval woman, fleeing her royal marriage to found a convent, devoting herself to prayer and charity. But peel back the layers and you'll find a masterclass in soft power. When Radegund escaped Clothar's court, she didn't just retreat from the world, she built her own. The monastery she established at Poitiers became a nerve center of diplomacy, a place where warring factions could meet under the guise of religious devotion. Kings and bishops sought her counsel, not because she commanded armies, but because her moral authority was untouchable. In an age where violence was the default language of politics, she spoke in hymns and alms, and men listened. Consider the audacity of her move. By embracing asceticism, Raidgun turned society's expectations upside down. A queen was supposed to bear heirs, host feasts, embody royal prestige. Instead, she wore rags, washed the feet of lepers, and gave away her wealth. Yet this wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Her extreme piety became her shield and her sword. When Clothar demanded she return to court, she didn't refuse him outright. She sent him a letter quoting scripture about the sanctity of vows to God. What could a king do? Forcefully drag a living saint back to his bed? The scandal would undermine his legitimacy. Raidgun understood something revolutionary. In a Christianizing Europe, holiness could outmaneuver heredity. But her influence didn't stop at personal salvation. Raidgun's monastery became a sanctuary for women fleeing violent marriages or political purges, effectively creating a parallel power structure outside male control. She negotiated with bishops to secure protections for her community, insisting on rules that prevented local lords from interfering. When two rival kings threatened to drag Poitiers into their war, she brokered a ceasefire by playing on their fear of divine retribution. Even her most famous act, bringing a fragment of the true cross to her monastery, wasn't just spiritual, it was a geopolitical coup. The relic drew pilgrims, wealth, and prestige, making Poitiers a center of influence no secular ruler could ignore. Historians often frame Raidgun's sainthood as the culmination of her story, but that misses the point. Canonization was simply the final stroke in a lifetime of calculated brilliance. Every barefoot pilgrimage, every night spent in prayer, every act of radical humility served a dual purpose: to secure her autonomy and to model a new kind of queenship. Where Brunhilda and Fredegund fought fire with fire, Raidgun disarmed her enemies by refusing to play by their rules. Her power didn't come from a throne, but from the unassailable position of someone who had renounced everything, and in that renunciation gained everything. So why does her legacy unsettle us? Perhaps because it forces a reckoning with how we define strength. We celebrate warrior queens who wielded swords, but Raidgun's weapon was her willingness to transform trauma into transcendence. She took the very system that sought to erase her, the brutal politics of conquest and marriage, and rewrote its rules, proving that in a world obsessed with domination, sometimes the most revolutionary act is to simply refuse to be broken. The Dark Ages had plenty of rulers who built kingdoms on bloodshed, but only one who built a sanctuary on scars, and that, it turns out, was the kingdom that endured. Matilda of Tuscany didn't need a crown to command respect. She earned it with steel and strategy. In an era when women were expected to wield needles, not swords, this formidable countess led armies, fortified castles, and outmaneuvered emperors. Her domain stretched across northern Italy, a patchwork of cities and strongholds that answered to her alone. But what's truly staggering isn't just the scale of her power, it's how deliberately history has downplayed it. While kings and popes fill our textbooks, Matilda's story lingers in the margins, as if her very existence unsettled the tidy narratives we prefer about the Middle Ages. Picture the scene: the late 11th century, a time when the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII were locked in a battle for supremacy known as the investiture controversy. At stake, who controlled the church and by extension the souls of Europe? Most nobles hedged their bets, switching sides as the winds shifted. Not Matilda. She stood unflinchingly with the Pope, turning her castles into papal strongholds and her armies into a bulwark against imperial ambition. When Henry marched into Italy to depose Gregory, it was Matilda who blocked his path at Canossa, forcing the emperor to kneel barefoot in the snow for 3 days before granting him absolution. This wasn't just politics, it was theater, and Matilda orchestrated every scene. But here's what the history books gloss over: her military brilliance. Matilda didn't just defend territory, she revolutionized warfare in Italy. She built a network of hilltop fortresses, each positioned to relay signals by fire across the Apennines, creating an early warning system that outsmarted larger forces. She trained peasant militias to fight like professional soldiers, turning farmers into a standing army loyal to her alone. And when Henry retaliated by besieging her cities, she didn't cower behind walls. She led daring night raids, burning enemy siege engines and vanishing into the fog before dawn. Chroniclers of the time, uneasy with a woman commanding battles, credited her victories to divine intervention. But read between the lines and you'll find meticulous tactics, not miracles. What's even more revealing is how Matilda wielded her influence off the battlefield. She spoke Latin, wrote legal decrees, and corresponded with scholars across Europe, positioning herself as both warlord and patron of the arts. Her court at Canossa became a haven for reformers, poets, and theologians, proof that she understood power wasn't just about territory but ideas. When the Pope needed a mediator, it was Matilda who brokered peace. When bishops disputed doctrine, they appealed to her judgment. And when Henry's forces finally overran her lands late in life, she simply regrouped, retaking her fortresses one by one until the emperor had no choice but to negotiate. So why does Matilda's legacy feel like a whispered secret? Partly because her enemies worked tirelessly to erase her. Imperial chroniclers dismissed her as the Pope's handmaiden, reducing her sovereignty to mere religious fervor. Later Renaissance historians, obsessed with tidy narratives of male genius, cast her as an anomaly, a fascinating exception rather than a blueprint for female leadership. Even Dante, who placed her in paradise, framed her as a pious figure rather than the military savant she was. But the truth is harder to bury. Matilda's reign proves that the Middle Ages were far more fluid than we assume. Titles didn't define power, competence did, and in a world that pretended women couldn't rule, she didn't ask for permission, she simply governed. The irony. Matilda's greatest defeat wasn't on any battlefield, it was in the history books. While kings and emperors left behind volumes of praise, her story survives in fragments. A letter here, a charter there, the grudging admiration of foes who couldn't ignore her. But perhaps that's the point. Matilda didn't fight for fame. She fought for a vision of Europe where authority came from ability, not birthright. And in the end, her silent triumph lies in the fact that we're still piecing together her legacy, still marveling at the woman who refused to be forgotten. Emma of Normandy didn't just witness history, she outlasted it. Twice a Queen of England, mother to two kings, and a pivotal player in the chaotic 11th century, Emma's story isn't just about survival, it's a masterclass in reinvention. Born into the Viking-ruled court of Normandy, she was married off as a teenager to Ethelred the Unready, a king whose nickname tells you everything about his reign. England was under siege, its cities burning under Danish raids, its nobility fracturing. Most queens would have been crushed by the weight of such chaos. Emma didn't just endure, she turned the turmoil to her advantage. When Ethelred's incompetence led to his overthrow by the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, Emma didn't flee to a nunnery or fade into obscurity. She did the unthinkable. She married Sweyn's son, Cnut, the new Viking ruler of England. To her critics, it was betrayal. To Emma, it was strategy. By binding herself to the conquering dynasty, she secured not just her own position but the future of her children. This wasn't mere opportunism, it was a calculated move to maintain stability in a kingdom teetering on collapse. Under Cnut's reign, Emma became more than a consort. She was a co-ruler, her name appearing alongside his in charters, her influence felt in every corner of the realm. But her true brilliance shone after Cnut's death. In the bloody scramble for succession, Emma maneuvered her son Harthacnut onto the throne only for him to die young, leaving England vulnerable once more. Enter Edward, her son from her first marriage, later known as the Confessor. Here's where Emma's legacy gets thorny. Chroniclers accused her of favoring one son over the other, of scheming, even of hoarding treasure. But peel back the propaganda and you'll find a woman doing what queens had always done, balancing the impossible demands of family, politics, and survival. The very same actions that would have been praised in a king were twisted into sins when performed by a queen. What sets Emma apart isn't just her political agility, it's her understanding of narrative. She commissioned a lavish book, the Encomium Emmi Regini, a glowing account of her reign that doubled as a weapon against her enemies. In an age when history was written by monks and biased chroniclers, Emma took control of her own story, shaping how future generations would see her. It's a reminder that power isn't just about who holds the crown, it's about who holds the pen. So what does her longevity reveal? That queens like Emma were the glue holding fractured kingdoms together. While kings waged war, queens waged diplomacy. While men claimed thrones through bloodshed, women like Emma secured them through marriages, treaties, and sheer endurance. Her reign spanned Viking raids, Danish conquests, and the slow birth of medieval England, a testament to the quiet, often overlooked labor of queens who ruled from the shadows. In the end, Emma's greatest victory wasn't just outliving her husbands, it was outsmarting an era that tried to erase her, and in that she wrote her own epitaph, not as a footnote to kings, but as the architect of their reigns. The Byzantine throne wasn't meant for women, at least. That's what the courtiers whispered when Irene of Athens seized it. In an empire where emperors ruled as gods' viceroys, the idea of a woman holding the scepter was unthinkable. Yet Irene didn't just break the rules, she rewrote them. Born into obscurity, married off to Emperor Leo IV as a political pawn, she could have faded into the gilded shadows of the palace like so many empresses before her. But Irene had other plans. When Leo died suddenly, leaving their 10-year-old son Constantine as heir, she stepped into the vacuum as regent and never looked back. What followed wasn't just a reign, it was a revolution. Irene didn't merely preside over ceremonies while men governed. She issued decrees, commanded armies, and even reversed her late husband's policies, reinstating the veneration of icons that he'd banned. Her court became a stage for unprecedented spectacle. When Arab ambassadors arrived, she received them alone on a towering throne, forcing them to kneel before a woman's authority. To the shock of Constantinople's elite, she signed official documents as Basilius Emperor, not the feminine Basilissa. The message was clear: she wouldn't rule as a placeholder, but as a sovereign. But power this bold came at a price. When her son Constantine came of age and tried to claim his birthright, Irene faced a choice no mother should have to make: surrender or fight. She chose the latter. After a brief civil war, she had Constantine captured, and then blinded, the traditional Byzantine method of rendering rivals unfit to rule. The chronicles claim she did it gently, ordering hot vinegar poured instead of molten lead to spare him agony, as if that could soften the horror. Was this cruelty or calculus? In a world where weakness meant death, Irene's actions followed a brutal logic. Mercy might have meant her own downfall, and with it, every precedent she'd set for women's rule. Yet even her harshest critics couldn't ignore her achievements. Irene negotiated the first peace treaty between Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate in decades, stabilizing an empire bleeding from constant war. She filled the treasury by reforming taxes, patronized scholars, and even audaciously proposed marriage to Charlemagne to unite the Eastern and Western empires. Her ambition was staggering, but so was the backlash. The very nobles who tolerated her rule while Constantine lived turned on her the moment he was gone, overthrowing her in a coup fueled as much by misogyny as politics. History remembers Irene as a paradox, both tyrant and trailblazer. Her story forces us to sit with uncomfortable questions. Would a man who blinded his son face the same condemnation? Or was Irene judged not just for her actions, but for daring to act at all? The Byzantine Empire wouldn't see another woman rule in her own name for over 500 years, a silence that speaks volumes. In the end, Irene's legacy isn't just about one woman's ruthless climb. It's about the price of shattering ceilings in a world that insists they must never break. While kings measured their legacies in battles won and lands conquered, queens like Ethelflad of Mercia built a different kind of empire, one of parchment and ink. Imagine the 9th century, a time when Viking raids left monasteries smoldering and libraries reduced to ashes. Amid this chaos, Ethelflad didn't just defend her kingdom's borders, she fortified its very soul. Her court at Tamworth became a sanctuary for scholars fleeing destruction, where scribes hunched over candlelit desks, copying texts that might otherwise have vanished forever. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. Ethelflad understood that survival wasn't just about swords, it was about stories. Take the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the most vital records of early English history. While its pages are filled with kings' exploits, few notice the quiet patronage that kept its scribes fed and sheltered. Ethelflad's support for such projects wasn't unique. Across Europe, queens like her recognized a truth their male counterparts often missed: culture was currency. When Alfonso III of Asturias wanted to cement his legitimacy, he didn't just build castles, he commissioned the Chronicle of Alfonso III, a masterpiece of medieval historiography. But behind that project stood Queen Jimna, whose influence ensured the work celebrated not just her husband's deeds, but the intellectual revival of Christian Spain. What's striking isn't just that these women funded learning, it's how they shaped it. In Ottonian Germany, Empress Theophanu, a Byzantine princess turned Holy Roman Empress, brought Greek manuscripts to the West, blending classical knowledge with emerging European thought. Her granddaughter, Empress Adelheid, founded monasteries that doubled as scriptoria, where monks preserved everything from Roman law to Arabic mathematics. These weren't passive acts of preservation, they were deliberate choices to curate the future. While warlords burned books, queens built libraries, knowing that controlling knowledge meant controlling how history would remember them. Yet their contributions often hide in plain sight. Open a medieval manuscript, and you might find a queen's name tucked into the margins, a tiny, commissioned by order of Her Majesty, overshadowed by the lavish illustrations of kings and saints. Even the Encomium Emmi Regini, a rare exception where a queen controlled her own narrative, was dismissed for centuries as propaganda. But dig deeper and the pattern emerges: where queens ruled, scholarship flourished. In Aquitaine, Elena's court birthed the troubadour tradition, turning poetry into political power. In Kiev, Olga's conversion to Christianity paved the way for Slavic literacy. Their legacy, a fragile thread of continuity stretching from the wreckage of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance. When Charlemagne's scholars revived classical learning, they stood on the shoulders of generations of women who'd safeguarded fragments of that knowledge in convents and courts. The very idea of the Dark Ages crumbles when you follow that thread, illuminated not by the glare of conquest, but by the steady glow of queens' candles, burning late into the night as scribes etched their world onto parchment. So the next time you marvel at a medieval manuscript, remember, it may have survived not because of a king's might, but a queen's foresight, and that's a light no shadow could extinguish. To understand the queens who shaped the Dark Ages, you have to follow the money straight to the church doors. In an era where faith and power were inseparable, these women didn't just attend Mass, they bankrolled the very institutions that defined medieval Europe. Take Queen Balthild, a former enslaved woman who rose to rule Neustria in the 7th century. After her husband's death, she didn't retreat. She redirected her wealth to monasteries like Chelles and Corbie, turning them into hubs of learning and influence. But here's the twist: these weren't just acts of devotion. Every abbey she funded became a node in her network, staffed with loyal abbesses who'd advocate for her policies long after her retirement. Then there's the case of Elena of Aquitaine, whose pilgrimage to Vézelay wasn't merely spiritual theater. By publicly taking the cross alongside her husband Louis VII, she tapped into the Church's moral authority to bolster their failing marriage and her own political standing. When that alliance crumbled, she pivoted, marrying Henry II and pouring resources into Fontevraud Abbey, a rare institution where women ruled over men. Coincidence? Hardly. Elena's patronage ensured her legacy would outlive the scandals that plagued her reign, but the most revealing examples lie in the shadows of these grand gestures. Look at the small, handwritten notes in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, requests for prayers, often naming the queen who commissioned them. These weren't vanity projects, they were spiritual insurance policies. In a world where eternity mattered more than earthly life, queens like Margaret of Scotland didn't just build churches, they curated their own salvation, negotiating with heaven as shrewdly as they did with barons. The line between piety and pragmatism blurs further when you examine their relationships with bishops. Matilda of Tuscany didn't just donate land to the church, she handpicked reformers like Pope Gregory VII, ensuring her allies controlled the pulpit. Meanwhile, in Byzantium, Empress Theodora's support for icon veneration wasn't just about theology. It was a direct challenge to her husband's policies, using the clergy as a counterweight to imperial authority. So were these women devout or calculating? The answer's buried in the stone of the abbeys they left behind. True faith and political survival aren't opposites, they're two sides of the same coin. When a queen funded a monastery, she bought more than a monument. She secured intercessors, educators, and chroniclers who'd shape her story for centuries. In the end, their greatest miracle wasn't building churches, it was building the narrative that they belonged in power, with heaven itself as their witness. Hollywood would have you believe medieval queens spent their days embroidering tapestries or waiting for knights to rescue them, but history tells a very different story. These women weren't just ornaments on a throne, they were architects of law, commanders of armies, and master negotiators who held fractured kingdoms together. Take Arauca of Leon and Castile, an 11th century queen who didn't just inherit a crown, she fought a decade-long civil war to keep it, outmaneuvering her ex-husband, rebellious nobles, and even her own sister. Or Melisende of Jerusalem, who ruled the Crusader states with such skill that when her husband tried to sideline her, the barons forced him to reinstate her authority. These weren't exceptions, they were the rule. So why does the damsel or villain caricature persist? Blame the chroniclers, monks and court historians who either sanitized queens into pious saints or demonized them as scheming seductresses. When Ethelflad of Mercia led armies against the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle downplayed her role, crediting victories to her brother while burying her contributions in vague phrasing. Centuries later, Shakespeare turned Margaret of Anjou into a shrieking harpy in Henry VI, erasing her real genius as a wartime leader. The pattern is clear. Women who wielded power openly had to be mythologized or monstrous because the alternative, acknowledging their competence, threatened the era's rigid hierarchies. But the truth is far more fascinating than the myths. These queens didn't just break the mold, they remade it to fit their needs. Look at Tamar of Georgia, the only woman to rule her kingdom in her own name during the 12th century. Instead of aping male rulers, she leaned into her identity, commissioning portraits that showed her holding a cross and a sword, divine authority and military might intertwined. Or Isabella of Castile, who didn't just fund Columbus's voyages but negotiated the terms herself, ensuring Spain's claims would be unshakable. Their power wasn't borrowed or begrudging, it was deliberate, innovative, and utterly their own. The damsel myth does more than distort history, it robs us of a crucial lesson. The Dark Ages weren't just a masculine drama of swords and conquests. They were a complex interplay of grit and diplomacy, where queens like Adelaide of Italy brokered peace between emperors and popes, or like Jadwiga of Poland traded her personal happiness for a political union that spared her kingdom war. To reduce them to stereotypes is to miss the real story. Leadership isn't about gender but ingenuity, and that's a truth as sharp as any sword. and far more enduring. Marriage in medieval Europe wasn't about love, it was about leverage. Queens weren't just brides, they were diplomats in silk and jewels. Their wedding vows the fine print in treaties that could alter the fate of nations. Take Matilda of Flanders, who transformed from a Norman duchess into William the Conqueror's queen, not by chance, but by cold calculation. Her dowry wasn't just land, it was legitimacy, binding restless Saxon nobles to their new Norman ruler through her bloodline. But here's what the chroniclers missed. Matilda didn't stop at being a political pawn. She used her position to broker peace between William and her own rebellious relatives, proving that a queen's loyalty could be her sharpest bargaining chip. Then there's the audacious play of Margaret of Denmark, who turned a child marriage into a masterstroke. At just 6 years old, she was betrothed to the King of Norway to settle a territorial dispute. By the time she was 20, she'd not only united Scandinavia under the Kalmar Union, but ruled it as de facto sovereign, her husband's early death leaving her the architect of a Nordic empire. This wasn't passive inheritance, it was strategy. Margaret understood that marriage contracts were living documents, their terms flexible in the hands of a ruler shrewd enough to exploit them. But the true artistry lay in queens who weaponized widowhood. When Blanche of Castile's husband, Louis VIII of France, died unexpectedly, she didn't retreat to the cloister as expected. Instead, she gripped the reins of power as regent, using her son's minority to consolidate royal authority and outmaneuver rebellious barons, her secret. The alliances she'd cultivated during her marriage ties that now answered to her, not her late husband's memory. Similarly, Anne of Kiev, married to Henry I of France to seal an alliance with the Rus, found her influence skyrocketed after his death. As regent, she introduced Byzantine administrative reforms to France, proving that a queen's foreign origins could be an asset rather than a weakness. Yet the most subversive marriages were those that defied expectations entirely. Look at Arauca of Leon, who turned her politically arranged union with Alfonso I of Aragon into a public spectacle of dysfunction, then used the scandal to justify annulling it and reclaiming sole control of her kingdom. Or Elena of Aquitaine, whose divorce from Louis VII wasn't defeat but liberation, freeing her to marry Henry II and forge the Angevin Empire. These queens didn't just play the game, they changed the rules, treating marriage less as a chain and more as a key, one that could unlock thrones, dissolve borders, or rewrite the future with a well-timed annulment. What makes their stories so electrifying isn't just the power they wielded, but the constraints they bent. In a world where bloodlines dictated destiny, these women proved that matrimony could be a sword as much as a shield, a tool to carve out realms, shatter expectations, and sometimes, against all odds, write their own endings. The real fairy tale, that history ever called them pawns at all. Succession in the medieval world was never guaranteed, it was seized, defended, and sometimes stolen. And when kings fell, it was often queens who stood between order and catastrophe, wielding influence that rarely made it into the official records. Take Adelaide of Burgundy, widowed at 19 when her husband, King Lothair of Italy, was poisoned by rivals. With her infant son's claim under threat, she didn't wait for men to act. She fled over the Alps in winter, sought refuge with Otto the Great of Germany, and married him within months, not for love but for an army. By the time the dust settled, she'd secured not just her son's inheritance but a new empire, becoming Holy Roman Empress. Yet chroniclers framed her as a pious widow, rescued by Otto, erasing her agency in the very survival of two kingdoms. Then there's the unsung tenacity of Constance of Sicily. When her nephew, the last Norman king of Sicily, died childless, she was thrust into a viper's nest of barons who'd rather burn the kingdom than see a woman rule. At 40, long past the age most medieval women were sidelined, she outmaneuvered them all. She married the future Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI not to surrender power, but to amplify it using his military might to crush rebellions while retaining control of Sicilian law and culture. When her son Frederick was born, she paraded him through Palermo's streets herself, a living symbol that the dynasty would endure. Her reward, historians reduced her to a footnote in her husband's conquests, ignoring how she'd saved Sicily from disintegration. The pattern is unmistakable. Queens who prevented civil wars were remembered as placeholders, while kings who started them were celebrated as decisive. Look at Blanche of Navarre, regent for her infant son Theobald in 13th century Champagne. When rebel lords smelled weakness, she didn't raise armies, she raised funds, buying off their allies until their coalition collapsed. She issued charters in her own name, presided over courts, and even negotiated with the Pope. Her reign was so effective that Champagne emerged stronger than before. Yet later chroniclers painted her as a temporary ruler, as if maintaining peace was somehow less remarkable than winning wars. What does this selective memory reveal? That history prizes drama over stability. A king who fights his way to power leaves behind chronicles rich with battle scenes and heroics. A queen who prevents that fight leaves behind quiet. No burning castles, no dramatic last stands, just the absence of chaos, which rarely makes for gripping sagas, but consider the cost of overlooking their contributions. When Melisende of Jerusalem defended her son Baldwin III's throne against usurpers, she didn't just preserve his crown, she ensured the Crusader states survived another generation. When Isabella of Portugal mediated the bitter feud between her husband and son over Castile succession, she averted a war that could have shattered Christian Spain on the eve of the Reconquista. Their victories were measured in wars that didn't happen, in borders that didn't bleed. Perhaps the greatest irony is how these queens' methods became blueprints for male rulers. The same tactics, strategic marriages, patronage networks, economic pressure were later hailed as genius when employed by kings like Henry VII of England or Louis XI of France. But when women pioneered them, they were dismissed as womanly wiles or worse. The truth is far simpler. In a world where power was precarious, queens couldn't afford the luxury of brute force. They had to be smarter, subtler, and often more effective. And that's precisely why their legacies unsettle us, because they force an uncomfortable question. What if the best leaders weren't the ones who won the wars, but the ones who prevented them? The history books may not have room for that answer, but the unbroken kingdoms they left behind speak volumes. Powerful queens didn't just face enemies on the battlefield. They fought shadows in the corridors of history, where whispers could be deadlier than swords. Take the case of Anne Boleyn, the most infamous example, but far from the only one. Accused of adultery, witchcraft, even incest, her downfall was sealed not by evidence, but by the sheer volume of scandal. Yet Anne's story isn't unique, it's part of a pattern. Centuries earlier, Fredegund of Neustria was painted as a poisoner by chroniclers who balked at her political savvy. Empress Wu Zetian of China, the only woman to rule in her own name, faced allegations of murdering her own child to seize power. These weren't just rumors, they were calculated strikes designed to undermine a woman's most vulnerable asset, her reputation. What's chilling is how familiar the playbook feels. The accusations leveled at medieval queens, too sexual, too ruthless, too ambitious, mirror the slurs hurled at women in power today. When a man negotiates fiercely, he's strong. When a woman does, she's shrill or difficult. The medieval chroniclers who called Brunhilda of Austrasia a manipulative hag weren't so different from modern commentators who reduce female leaders to emotional or erratic figures. The labels change, but the game remains the same. Discredit the woman, and you discredit her authority. But here's what these smear campaigns reveal about the women they targeted. The more outlandish the accusation, the more power the queen must have wielded. Take the legend of Queen Ethelflad, accused of murdering her stepson to secure her own son's throne. The story, likely fabricated by political rivals, tells us less about Ethelflad and more about the fear she inspired. A queen who could allegedly orchestrate such a plot wasn't just a villain, she was a force to be reckoned with. Similarly, the rumors surrounding Irene of Aquitaine's court of love, where she supposedly encouraged infidelity, were less about her morals and more about her refusal to be sidelined. The irony, these slanders often backfired. The very tactics meant to erase these queens from history ended up preserving their legacies in twisted form. We remember Anne Boleyn not just because she was executed, but because the lies about her were so lurid they became unforgettable. The whispers that once sought to destroy her now ensure she's never forgotten. And that's the ultimate twist. In trying to silence these women, their enemies gave them a kind of immortality. The smear campaigns meant to break them only proved how formidable they truly were, so threatening that lies were the only weapons left to use. History remembers Charlemagne as the father of Europe for his conquests, yet when Empress Irene blinded her son to secure power, she was branded a monster. Both rulers used brutality to protect their thrones, but only one faced eternal condemnation. This wasn't an exception, it was the rule. Kings could slaughter rivals and be called great, while queens who made tough choices were vilified as unnatural or wicked. The difference, not their actions, but the lens through which chroniclers and later historians chose to view them. Take William the Conqueror. His invasion of England in 1066 left thousands dead, villages razed, and a nation subjugated. Yet textbooks celebrate his strong leadership and administrative reforms. Now contrast that with Matilda of England, his granddaughter, who fought a civil war to claim her rightful throne. When she imprisoned her rival, Stephen of Blois, chroniclers recoiled, calling her haughty and unwomanly. Never mind that Stephen had broken an oath to recognize her as Queen. Matilda's refusal to yield was framed as arrogance, not resolve. The same steel that made kings heroic made queens inhuman. This double standard didn't just tarnish reputations, it shaped realms. When a king like Henry II clashed with the church, it was a political drama. When a queen like Irene of Aquitaine dared the same, it became a morality tale. Her patronage of courtly love poetry, proof of decadence, her strategic divorce from Louis VII. Shameless ambition. Never mind that Louis's incompetence had nearly bankrupted France. Irene's pragmatism was twisted into a character flaw. Kings could be flawed yet formidable. Queens had to be saints or sinners with no room for complexity. Fast forward to today, and the echoes are unmistakable. Modern female leaders still walk this tightrope. A male CEO is decisive. A woman with the same demeanor is bossy. A king's infidelity is a footnote, but a queen's rumored affairs like Anne Boleyn's become the heart of her legacy. The medieval scribes who painted powerful women as witches or seductresses set a template that outlasted feudalism by centuries. Their pens didn't just record history, they weaponized it, yet there's a revealing irony in this bias. The very traits that made queens threatening, their diplomatic finesse, their ability to rule through networks rather than brute force, often made them more effective than their male counterparts. While kings waged costly wars, queens like Irene and Matilda built alliances that stabilized kingdoms for generations. Their methods weren't weaker, they were wiser. But in a world that equated authority with aggression, their successes had to be downplayed or demonized. the real lesson here isn't just about the past. It's about the stories we still tell and who gets to be the hero in them. When we uncritically repeat medieval chroniclers' judgments, we inherit their biases. But when we peel back the layers, we find a truth far more compelling. The so-called Dark Ages were full of women who ruled with brilliance, grit, and ingenuity. Their only crime, doing it while wearing a crown instead of a coronet, and that's a standard worth dismantling then and now. Beyond the sprawling kingdoms of continental Europe, where royal women often had to wield power from the shadows, the Celtic world offered a strikingly different stage for queens like Ethelflad of Mercia and Gormlaith of Ireland. These women didn't just operate within their societies, they shaped them openly, commanding armies, brokering treaties, and ruling with a visibility that would have been unthinkable in Paris or Constantinople. So what set their world apart? The answer lies in the tangled web of Celtic law, culture, and sheer necessity that redefined what power could look like when it wore a woman's face. Take the legal landscape. While Frankish and Byzantine queens navigated rigid inheritance systems built around male primogeniture, Celtic societies often recognized what was called derbfine, a kinship system where leadership could pass laterally to the most capable relative, not just vertically from father to son. This meant a king's daughter or sister might inherit power if she proved the strongest candidate. In Ireland, the legendary Queen Medb of Connacht wasn't some mythical anomaly. She was a reflection of Brehon law's flexibility, which allowed women to hold property, initiate divorces, and even lead armies as Banrig warrior queens. When Gormlaith, the infamous Helen of Ireland, married and divorced 3 rival kings in the 10th century, she wasn't just a pawn in their games, she was a player, using marital alliances to elevate her son Brian Boru to the high kingship. Geography played its part too. In the fractured, decentralized world of Celtic Britain and Ireland, where petty kingdoms rose and fell with the seasons, survival demanded adaptability. Ethelflad, the Lady of the Mercians, didn't just inherit her father Alfred the Great's fight against the Vikings, she reinvented it. While Wessex's male rulers obsessed over pitched battles, Ethelflad built a network of fortified towns, bars that slowly strangled Viking supply lines. She didn't need to mimic male rulers because her strategy, patient, pragmatic, and deeply rooted in local knowledge, proved more effective than brute force. But perhaps the most striking difference was the cultural memory these women could draw upon. Celtic mythology brimmed with formidable women like Scathach the warrior trainer or the sovereignty goddesses who chose kings. This wasn't just storytelling, it was a cultural script that normalized female authority. When Ethelflad led Mercian troops into battle, she wasn't defying expectations, she was fulfilling them. Even the Christianized Celtic Church, with its abbesses like Brigid of Kildare who wielded bishop-like authority, offered models of female leadership absent in Rome-dominated Europe. Yet this relative openness came at a cost. The same decentralized systems that enabled queens to rise also made their legacies fragile. Without centralized chroniclers to record their deeds, many Celtic queens slipped into obscurity, their achievements absorbed into male kin's legends. Gormlaith, for all her political genius, is remembered less as a strategist and more as a tragic figure in her son's saga. Ethelflad's successors erased her from Mercian genealogies, folding her reign into her brother's narrative. The real lesson of these Celtic queens isn't just about gender, it's about how power adapts to survive. In places where rigid hierarchies crumbled under Viking axes or clan rivalries, pragmatism trumped prejudice. When survival demanded a queen's diplomacy as much as a king's sword, societies found ways to let women lead, and that's why their stories still resonate. not as exceptions, but as proof that history's rules were always more flexible than we've been told. The Dark Ages weren't dark everywhere, and in places where the light shone differently, so too did the faces of power. When we think of medieval law, images of robed judges and parchment-clutching kings might come to mind, but dig deeper, and you'll find the fingerprints of queens who rewrote the rules from behind the scenes. Take Archaea of Leon, the fiery 12th century ruler who didn't just inherit her father's crown. She inherited his legal reforms. Under her reign, Leon's Furo's local legal codes expanded to protect widows' right to inherit property, a radical notion in a world where women were often stripped of land the moment their husbands died. But Archaea didn't stop there. She personally presided over courts, settling disputes between nobles with a blend of pragmatism and steel that left chroniclers grudgingly impressed. Her legacy, a blueprint for gender-inclusive property rights that would ripple across Iberia for centuries. Then there's the lesser-known but equally formidable Blanche of Navarre, who ruled Champagne in the 13th century. When her husband died on crusade, leaving her with an infant heir, she didn't just keep the throne warm, she overhauled the entire legal system. Blanche's Coutumier de Champagne standardized inheritance laws, ensuring daughters couldn't be disinherited in favor of distant male relatives. She even established protections for Jewish communities, a startling move in an era of rising anti-Semitism. Critics called it sentimentality. In truth, it was cold-eyed strategy. By safeguarding minorities, she ensured the economic stability of her realm, proof that queens often saw justice as inseparable from governance. But perhaps the most enduring legal legacy comes from an unexpected corner: the convents. Queens like Matilda of Scotland, wife of Henry I of England, didn't just fund monasteries, they turned them into legal laboratories. Matilda's patronage of Romsey Abbey created a sanctuary where women could study canon law, a loophole that allowed noble women to argue cases in church courts. These precedents quietly seeped into secular law, laying groundwork for concepts like marital consent and protections against domestic abuse. When Helena of Aquitaine later championed the courts of love, dismissing marriages forced upon noblewomen, she was building on this hidden tradition of female legal resistance. The irony: many of these reforms were credited to kings or masked as religious edicts. Take the Sayat Partidas, the monumental legal code of Castile. While King Alfonso X gets the glory, historians now recognize the hand of his queen, Violent of Aragon, in its most progressive clauses, like recognizing rape as a crime against the victim, not just her male relatives. Similarly, when Norwegian law codes suddenly included protections for peasant women in the 14th century, few noticed it coincided with Queen Margaret's reign. Queens understood that lasting change required subtlety. They embedded equality in statutes while letting men take the credit, ensuring their reforms would outlive them. So why does this matter today? Because these legal ghosts still walk among us. The concept of dower rights, a widow's claim to her husband's estate, traces back to queens like Helena of Provence, who insisted on codifying it in English common law. The very idea that a woman could testify in court or inherit land. Thank Merovingian queens like Brunhilda, who embedded these rights in Frankish law to protect their own power. Even modern debates over marital property and reproductive autonomy echo medieval queens' quiet battles to control their bodies and wealth, the real twist. These women didn't just bend the law to their advantage, they bent it forward. In a world that told them they couldn't rule, they ruled through legislation, turning parchment into power. Their greatest trick wasn't breaking the system, but rewriting it so thoroughly that we forgot they held the pen. And that's the most subversive legacy of all. The laws we take for granted today were often forged by women history erased. A tapestry in Bayeux tells the story of conquest with bold embroidery, but search its threads for Matilda of Flanders, and you'll find only a shadow at the edge of the frame. This vanishing act wasn't accidental. Medieval art and chronicles didn't just depict queens, they sculpted their legacies with deliberate hands, erasing some features while exaggerating others into grotesque caricatures. Take the Chanson de Roland, where Queen Bramamon's conversion to Christianity is framed as a triumph of male piety, ignoring the political calculus that likely drove her choice. Or the Vita Mathildis, which paints Matilda of Tuscany as a saintly virgin despite her battlefield prowess, as if her military genius needed sanctification to be palatable. The distortion wasn't subtle. In illuminated manuscripts, powerful queens were often literally miniaturized, their figures smaller than the men around them, their gestures demure even when ruling empires. The Liber ad Honorem Augusti shows Empress Constance of Sicily holding a scepter, but her gaze is lowered, her posture passive, a visual lie for a woman who crushed rebellions with merciless efficiency. Meanwhile, negative portrayals loomed large. Gregory of Tours' Historia Francorum depicts Fredegund as a pantomime villain, poisoning enemies with comical frequency, while her tax reforms and legal codes vanish from the record. Music proved just as manipulative. Troubadour songs spun Elena of Aquitaine into either a lovelorn muse or a wanton seductress, ignoring her role in crafting the very courtly love tradition they celebrated. The Carmina Burana reduces noble women to prizes or temptresses, their political marriages were written as romantic fables. Even religious art followed suit. Frescoes of Saint Raidgun show her barefoot and weeping, emphasizing piety over her deft diplomacy, a deliberate choice to soften her influence. But the most insidious distortions were the omissions. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle dedicates pages to Ethelred the Unready's blunders, but reduces Ethelflad's military victories to footnotes. Byzantine mosaics that immortalize emperors in gold tesserae often relegate empresses to the corners, their titles etched in smaller, fainter script. These weren't oversights, they were silences with purpose. By erasing queens' public roles, chroniclers made their power seem unnatural, their authority an aberration rather than a fact. Yet cracks in the facade remain. Look closely at the Morgan leaf, a rare manuscript illumination showing Matilda of England commanding knights, her figure central and unapologetically regal. Or the Chronicle of Alfonso III, where Queen Gymna's name appears alongside her husband's in legal decrees, her influence too blatant to whitewash. These fragments reveal the truth. Queens didn't just exist in the margins, they were pushed there. The lesson isn't just about medieval bias, it's about who controls the narrative. When a queen's patronage funded a tapestry, her image thrived. When her enemies commissioned the chronicle, she became a cautionary tale. The real power wasn't in ruling, it was in deciding how that rule would be remembered. And that, perhaps, was the battle these women couldn't always win. The whispers that once painted Brunhilda of Austrasia as a scheming which now echo in modern headlines, where female leaders face eerily similar scripts. When a queen like Theodora of the Franks was dismissed as a mere peace weaver for her diplomatic marriages, it wasn't so different from today's politicians labeled as conniving for mastering coalition building. The pattern is uncanny. Women in power have always been measured by a double standard, their competence reframed as cunning, their ambition as arrogance. Consider how Empress Irene's brutal pragmatism was condemned as monstrous, while Charlemagne's conquests were celebrated. Fast forward to contemporary politics, and you'll find female leaders still walking the same tightrope, praised for empathy but punished for assertiveness, their every move scrutinized through a lens their male counterparts rarely face. But the parallels run deeper than perception. medieval queens often ruled during crises, wars, succession disputes, economic collapse, just as modern women frequently inherit leadership in tumultuous times. Think of Angela Merkel steering Europe through the financial crisis, or Jacinda Ardern navigating a pandemic and terrorist attack. Like Ethelflad of Mercia fortifying her kingdom against Viking raids, these leaders are handed fractured systems and expected to rebuild them, only to have their successes attributed to luck or circumstance. The chroniclers of old would have recognized the playbook. When a man stabilizes a nation, he's a hero. When a woman does it, she's just holding the fort. The most potent lesson from these queens isn't just about surviving slander, it's about weaponizing it. Helena of Aquitaine turned scandal into power by embracing her reputation as a political operator, using it to broker alliances men couldn't touch. Today, figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Kamala Harris follow similar blueprints, reframing criticism as proof of their disruptive potential. When detractors called AOC too radical, she amplified the label, leveraging it to mobilize a generation. It's a tactic straight from Matilda of Tuscany's playbook. If they'll call you a witch anyway, you might as well own the broomstick. Yet the starkest parallel lies in Erasure. Just as scribes minimized Ethelflad's military victories or reduced Raidgun to a pious recluse, modern media often distills complex female leaders into caricatures: the Iron Lady, the nurturer, the diva. Hillary Clinton's policy expertise was overshadowed by email scandals. Margaret Thatcher's economic reforms were reduced to her handbag. This isn't coincidence, it's continuity. The machinery that scrubbed medieval queens from chronicles still operates today, just with algorithms instead of quills. So what's the takeaway? That resilience isn't enough. These queens didn't just endure, they rewrote the rules, building power structures that outlasted their detractors. When Archaeology of Leon faced rebellion, she didn't beg for legitimacy. She minted coins with her own image, forcing the world to see her authority. Modern leaders like Sanna Marin or Tsai Ing-wen embody that same defiance, refusing to apologize for their competence. The real legacy of these forgotten queens isn't just their survival, it's their blueprint for turning marginalization into momentum. Because the playbook hasn't changed in 1,000 years, but neither has their ability to tear it apart. Archaeology doesn't just dig up artifacts, it exhumes truth. For centuries, the stories of these queens survived only in the slanted ink of their enemies' chronicles, their voices muffled by time and bias. But now, trowels and brushes are chiseling away at those distortions, one fragment at a time. Take the stunning discovery in Magdeburg, Germany, where a lavish 10th century grave was unearthed in 2008. At first, archaeologists assumed it belonged to a king, until the bones revealed a woman buried with a ceremonial crozier, the staff of a bishop. This was no ordinary noblewoman. This was likely Edith, granddaughter of Alfred the Great, a Saxon princess married off to Otto I to seal an alliance. Her remains, analyzed with isotope testing, traced her journey from England's Wessex to her final resting place, proving she wasn't just a political pawn but a bridge between cultures. Then there's the quiet revolution happening in manuscript studies. Infrared imaging has resurrected words scrubbed from parchment, like those in the so-called burned letters of Helena of Aquitaine. Censored by medieval monks, her original correspondence now reveals blunt negotiations with popes and kings, showing her not as the lovelorn figure of legend but as a hard-nosed strategist. Similarly, in 2019, a palimpsest in a Spanish monastery yielded a hidden charter signed by Archaeology of Leon, proof she issued laws in her own name, not just as her father's heir. These aren't just corrections to the historical record, they're acts of defiance against centuries of erasure. Even everyday objects whisper secrets. A humble brooch found in Norfolk, engraved with the name Ethelflad, suggests the Mercian queen's influence stretched further than chroniclers admitted. A chess piece carved in the likeness of a woman unearthed in southern Italy hints at Matilda of Tuscany's reputation as a player in the game of empires. And in Istanbul, a mosaic recently uncovered in the Great Palace depicts a woman in imperial purple, likely Zoe Porphyrogenita, her face altered by later hands to diminish her presence. The message is clear: someone tried to erase her, but the stones refused to forget. The most poignant revelations come from the margins, literally. Scribbled notes in the flyleaves of gospel books, long dismissed as doodles, are now recognized as Queen's financial records. A fragment of linen from a nun's habit in Fontevraud Abbey tested positive for expensive Tyrian purple dye, suggesting Elena of Aquitaine's retirement wasn't as austere as portrayed. Even teeth tell stories. Analysis of plaque from medieval skeletons has identified traces of exotic spices, evidence of trade networks maintained by queens like Margaret of Denmark, who imported saffron and pepper to showcase her realm's reach. What emerges from these fragments isn't just a new chapter of history, it's a new way of seeing. Archaeology doesn't just add women to the story, it exposes how systematically they were edited out. Every time a grave yields a sword beside a spindle, or a letter resurfaces with a queen's seal intact, we're reminded the past was far more textured than the records let on. The Dark Ages weren't silent, we just weren't listening to half the voices. Now, as dirt and technology conspire to uncover them, these queens are finally stepping out of the margins, not as footnotes, but as architects of the world we inherited. And the most thrilling part, we've only scratched the surface. The erasure of these queens wasn't some passive oversight. It was a deliberate campaign waged with ink and parchment. Medieval chroniclers didn't just forget to mention women's achievements. They actively scrubbed them from the record, often under orders from the very men who feared their influence. Take the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which meticulously documented every battle fought by Alfred the Great, but reduced his daughter Ethelflad's military victories to vague asides. The message was clear: a woman's leadership was an anomaly, not a precedent worth preserving. This wasn't just about omission, it was about distortion. When queens couldn't be ignored, they were caricatured. Powerful women like Fredegund were painted as poisoners, their political acumen reframed as witchcraft. Diplomatic queens like Theodora of the Franks became peace weavers. Their strategic marriages reduced to passive acts of stitching alliances rather than wielding them. Even piety could be weaponized. Holy women like Raidgun were celebrated only when their sanctity overshadowed their sovereignty. The chronicles gave them two choices, villain or virgin, with no room for complexity. The tools of this erasure were as subtle as they were effective. Manuscript illuminations shrank queens' figures beside towering kings. Their authority literally diminished on the page. Legal charters credited reforms to husbands or sons, even when the handwriting matched a queen's scribe, and when all else failed, there was always slander. Empress Irene's reign was recast as a cautionary tale about female ambition, her political brilliance overshadowed by lurid tales of her son's blinding. The goal wasn't just to erase these women, it was to ensure no one would dare follow their example. But why? Because history wasn't just a record, it was propaganda. Monasteries, where most chronicles were written, relied on royal patronage. Acknowledging queens as legitimate rulers threatened the very idea of divine right kingship. If a woman could govern as well as a man, what did that say about God's supposed preference for male authority? Worse, it risked inspiring others. When Matilda of England fought for her throne in the 12th century, churchmen warned it would make every wife rebel against her husband. The stakes weren't just about the past, they were about controlling the future. Yet the most insidious bias wasn't in the writing, it was in the keeping. Queen's letters, legal decrees, and personal accounts were rarely preserved with the same care as kings. Helena of Aquitaine's correspondence survives in fragments, while her husband Henry II's fills archives. Byzantine empresses' speeches were deemed unworthy of transcription, their policy debates reduced to gossip. Even when queens commissioned their own histories, like Emma of Normandy's encomium, later scribes dismissed them as vanity projects. The silence wasn't accidental, it was systemic. The irony is crushing. These women built the very institutions that erased them. Queens funded the monasteries where monks wrote them out of scripture, patronized the artists who minimized their portraits, even paid the chroniclers who slandered them. Their power was so threatening that history had to pretend it never existed, or risk exposing the lie that only men could rule. But here's what the erasers didn't count on. Parchment fades, but legacy lingers. Every time we dig up a brooch inscribed with a queen's name, decipher a palimpsest revealing her laws, or test the bones of a woman buried with a king's regalia, we're not just rediscovering history. We're rewriting it. History books might have tried to bury these queens, but scholars today are armed with sharper tools than ever. Not swords, but scanners, databases, and sheer stubbornness. Take Dr. Katrin Jansen, a historian who spent years combing through 9th century charters, spotting a pattern everyone else missed. Faint scribbles in the margins, initials tucked beneath royal seals, evidence that Queen Ethelflad of Mercia didn't just approve documents, she drafted them. These weren't passive endorsements, but active governance hidden in plain sight. Jansen's discovery didn't just rewrite Ethelflad's story, it exposed how systematically women's labor was erased. When a king signed a law, it was recorded as his achievement. When a queen did the same, the scribe might credit her husband or son, as if her hand had never touched the parchment. This isn't just about correcting the record, it's about confronting the machinery of erasure. In archives across Europe, teams like the Women's Early Political Leadership Project are using spectral imaging to recover obliterated names. At the University of Barcelona, researchers recently found a 12th century chronicle where Arroca of Leon's victories had been scratched out and replaced with her father's name. The ink was faded, but the betrayal was fresh. It's not neglect, says medievalist Dr. Sofia Ramirez. It's active sabotage. Someone didn't want Arroca remembered as a ruler, only as a daughter. The fight extends beyond dusty manuscripts. Archaeologists like Dr. Lisa Biddle are re-examining graves long mislabeled as warrior burials simply because they contained swords. At a dig in Normandy, Biddle's team uncovered a skeleton buried with a spear and a spindle, its DNA confirming it was female. Local records had dismissed the site as a knight's grave, but carbon dating placed it squarely in the reign of Emma of Normandy. Suddenly, the idea of queens leading battles wasn't just plausible, it was probable. We've been taught to see warriors as male by default, Biddle notes. But the bones don't lie. Perhaps the most radical work is happening in linguistics. For centuries, terms like peace weaver or mother of the realm made queen's power sound domestic, even decorative. But scholars like Dr. Elena Parker are dissecting Old English and Latin texts to reveal the steel beneath the euphemisms. When a 10th century poem calls Queen Aelfrith the land's anchor, Parker argues it's not metaphor, it's legal terminology, acknowledging her role as regent. These weren't flattering nicknames, she insists. They were job descriptions. The backlash to this scholarship tells its own story. When Dr. Maria Fernandez published evidence that Matilda of Tuscany personally commanded troops at Canossa, a prominent historian dismissed it as wishful thinking despite 7 eyewitness accounts. Another academic argued that Empress Irene's reign was too unstable to count as true rulership, ignoring the fact that half the Byzantine emperors faced rebellions. The double standard is glaring. Men's authority is assumed, women's must be proven beyond doubt, yet every reclaimed name chips away at the old narrative. In Oxford, a team is reconstructing burned letters between Helena of Aquitaine and Byzantine envoys, revealing trade deals brokered without her husband's knowledge. In Vienna, art restorers found layers of paint obscuring a fresco of Queen Gisela of Hungary holding a scepter, later overpainted to make it look like a prayer book. And in a quiet corner of Twitter, the hashtag #ReclaimTheQueens has become a rallying cry, with amateur historians sharing overlooked sources and debating translations. This isn't just academic nitpicking, it's a reckoning with how history gets made and who gets to decide. For every Brunhilda vilified as a witch, for every Ethelflad reduced to a footnote, there's a scholar today holding up a magnifying glass to the cracks in the official story. They're not just recovering lost queens, they're proving that the Dark Ages were only dark for those history chose not to see. And in that light, even the smallest discovery, a faded initial, a misplaced spindle, a scratched-out name becomes an act of defiance. So here's a question to leave you with: if you could step into the past and sit down with one of these queens, who would it be? Not just to marvel at their crowns or their courts, but to ask the questions history forgot to record. Would you choose Ethelflad, the warrior queen who fortified England against Vikings, and demand to know how she commanded respect in a world that wanted her silent? Or would you seek out Raidgun, the enslaved princess turned saint, and ask how she transformed trauma into unshakable authority? Maybe you'd corner Fredegund in a shadowy corridor and ask point blank if the rumors of her poisonings were true, or just the slander of men who feared her ruthlessness. Imagine pressing Empress Irene on that infamous moment she blinded her son. Was it monstrous ambition or the only move left to protect everything she'd built? Or perhaps you'd sit with Matilda of Tuscany as she surveyed her hilltop fortresses, asking how it felt to outmaneuver emperors twice her size. And what about Helena of Aquitaine? After 2 kings, a crusade, and a prison cell, what lesson would she whisper to women today about power and survival? This isn't just a fantasy, it's a way to measure their legacies against our own world. The challenges they faced: erasure, double standards, the constant fight to be heard aren't relics, they're mirrors. So tell us, which queen's story grips you? Is it the strategist, the saint, the survivor? Whose voice do you wish could cut through the centuries? Drop your picks below, and let's keep their stories alive. After all, history isn't just about looking back. It's about asking what we'd do in their shoes, and who knows, the answers might just change how you see your own battles. Take the tale of Brunhilda of Austrasia, branded a wicked stepmother by medieval chroniclers for defending her grandson's throne. The same actions that would have been praised as shrewd strategy in a king were twisted into cruelty when performed by a queen. This wasn't an isolated case, it was a pattern. When Fredegund of Neustria eliminated rivals to protect her son's inheritance, she wasn't called a devoted regent. She was labeled a poisoner, her political acumen reduced to cartoonish villainy. The wicked stepmother trope didn't emerge from reality. It was a narrative weapon, wielded to pathologize women who dared to prioritize power over passivity. Then there's the enduring myth of the damsel in distress, a cliché that collapses under scrutiny when you examine queens like Ethelflad of Mercia. While legends paint her as a fragile noblewoman waiting for her brother Edward to rescue her kingdom from Vikings, the historical record tells a different story. She fortified towns, led armies, and negotiated treaties. all while chroniclers awkwardly contorted their language to avoid admitting a woman was outmaneuvering seasoned warlords. Even her epithet, Lady of the Mercians, feels like a linguistic dodge, as if calling her queen would acknowledge her authority too plainly. The most insidious myths, though, are the ones that erase ambition altogether. Take Theodora of the Franks, remembered as a peace weaver for her diplomatic marriages. The term sounds gentle, almost decorative, like she was stitching alliances with needle and thread. But dig deeper, and you'll find a master strategist using marital bonds as geopolitical leverage, turning family trees into power grids. Similarly, Raidgun's sainthood overshadows her political genius. Her monastery wasn't just a refuge, it was a nerve center of influence where kings sought counsel under the guise of piety. These women weren't passive conduits for male power, they were architects of it. Even positive stereotypes distorted reality. The Virgin Queen ideal, embodied by Matilda of Tuscany, framed her military prowess as an exception granted by divine favor, as if her competence needed celestial justification. Meanwhile, Helena of Aquitaine's intellectual patronage was recast as romantic indulgence, her courts of love mythologized into frivolity rather than recognized as the political salons they were. The double standard is glaring. Men's accomplishments stood on their own merits, while women's required alibis, holiness, maternal instinct, or tragic circumstance. The real tragedy: these myths didn't just shape the past, they curated the future. By recasting queens as either monsters or muses, chroniclers ensured subsequent generations would lack models of female leadership that were nuanced, flawed, and human. When Shakespeare turned Margaret of Anjou into a shrieking harpy in Henry VI, or Victorian historians dismissed Empress Matilda's civil war as hysterical, they were following a playbook written centuries earlier. The goal wasn't just to slander individual women, it was to make the very idea of female authority seem unnatural. Yet fragments of truth persist. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles' reluctant praise of Ethelflad's campaigns, in the grudging respect of Byzantine scribes for Irene's tax reforms, we catch glimpses of the reality beneath the propaganda. These weren't caricatures, they were rulers who negotiated, innovated, and occasionally brutalized their way through crises, just like their male counterparts. The difference wasn't their methods, but the stories told about them. And that's the ultimate irony. The very myths meant to diminish these queens now serve as proof of their extraordinary influence. After all, you don't spend centuries smearing someone unless they mattered, deeply, disruptively, and indelibly. These queens refused to be footnotes in their own stories, ruling kingdoms, commanding armies, and rewriting the rules of power when the world insisted they had no right to hold the pen. Their legacies whisper through time not because they fit neatly into the roles history assigned them, but because they shattered those roles entirely. Think of Brunhilda defying assassination attempts for 40 years while reforming laws that outlived her. Remember Ethelflad fortifying England against Viking invasions while chroniclers struggled to describe a woman leading battles without calling it a miracle. These weren't exceptions to the Dark Ages, they were its architects, working in stone and parchment where others saw only chaos. What makes their stories so electrifying isn't just their defiance, it's their ingenuity. In a world that denied them swords, they wielded diplomacy. Where they were barred from thrones, they built networks of allies no army could topple. Theodora of the Franks turned marriage treaties into geopolitical chess moves. Raidgun transformed a monastery into a seat of power even kings couldn't ignore. And Irene of Athens didn't just break Byzantine tradition by ruling alone. She forced an empire to kneel before a woman holding the scepter, proving authority wasn't about gender but sheer force of will. Yet for all their brilliance, their greatest battle was against oblivion. Chroniclers scrubbed their names from records, artists shrank their figures in tapestries, and later historians dismissed them as villains or saints, anything but rulers. But traces remain: a charter signed in a queen's hand, a fortress built under her command, a grave filled with treasures that whisper of her influence. These fragments are rebellions in their own right, refusing to let us forget. So why does reclaiming their stories matter now? Because history isn't just about the past, it's a mirror. When we reduce the Middle Ages to kings and knights, we inherit a vision of power that's half-formed. But when we restore these queens to their rightful places, we see the full tapestry, a world where leadership wore many faces and resilience took forms textbooks rarely acknowledged. Their lives challenge us to ask who else has been erased from the narratives we take as gospel, and what truths might still be hiding in the margins. The Dark Ages weren't dark because civilization faltered. They were darkened by the choices of those who recorded them, leaving half the cast in the shadows. But light survives in unexpected places, in the laws queens passed, the alliances they brokered, the books they saved from fire. And as we piece together their legacies, we're not just correcting the record, we're proving that power in any era is never just about who holds the crown. It's about who refuses to be erased. Now it's your turn. Whose story gripped you the most? Is there another forgotten figure you'd add to this tapestry? The conversation doesn't end here. Hit subscribe, and let's keep pulling threads until the whole fabric of history comes undone, because the past isn't settled. It's waiting to be rewritten.